Welcome to the Bleep Bulimia podcast with guest Elwin Robinson, founder of Genetic Insights. Hi, everyone. I am Lorianne. I am the host of Bleep Bulimia. And in this episode, I have Elwin Robinson. He is the founder of Genetic Insights and Rejuvenate podcast. And I'm very pleased to have you here today. Thank you so much for being a guest.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So this is really interesting. When I saw, there's information about DNA and so on, and I'm not going to get into it because you're going to have to explain it, but it did intrigue me because I did do a DNA test, and my mother actually found her cousins through this that she was looking for that she didn't even know existed.
Mm.
So this is very interesting, and you're going to get even more into that. So thank you again. So I'm going to start off because I'm always interested. What inspired you to get into this?
Well, I had my own health challenge, which is not bulimia specifically, but vaguely related, I guess. Long story short, I got in a position where, because I had severe digestive pain, I was not able to eat properly, and I'd always been underweight my whole life, which I assumed was genetics because my mother was overweight, my father was very skinny, so I thought, well, I'll just take after my dad, guess that's normal. And it culminated when I was about 40 with a severe digestive pain, and no one could find a solution for it. And when I say no one, I tried all kinds of, extremely conventional medical doctors, specialist medical doctors, did all kinds of MRI scans, CT scan, all kinds of blood work, all kinds of alternative practitioners, functional medicine, herbalists, naturopath, all those kind of guys. Then I thought, well, maybe it's a structural issue, so I went to see osteopaths, craniosacral physiotherapists, you name it, right? So, and then all of that didn't work, and I thought, well, maybe it's some emotional issue. So I started seeing a therapist and looking at the spiritual dimension and like every possible thing that it could be. And I'm kind of glad it happened to me in some ways because I learned a lot, and I probably did do some work on my inner self that I might not have done otherwise. But none of it actually helped with the pain. And in fact, a lot of the physical stuff actually made it worse. And I got to the point where I'd lost a lot of weight. I'm 6'3", and I'd been about 150 pounds most of my life, so already pretty thin. But I got down to about 120, 125 pounds. I was very, very skinny for someone who was trying their best to eat. But if every time you eat, you're in severe pain, it discourages you from eating. Let's just put it that way. And I developed all kinds of other issues that may relate to some of your audience. Like I had severe anxiety, probably close to panic attacks. I felt cold all of the time. I had, I had all kinds of other issues like sinus issues and a lot of allergies and a lot of chronic issues that do happen as a result of slowing down your metabolism, and slowing down your metabolism happens as a result of not eating enough. So, by having one problem, it actually created a lot of other problems in me due to not eating. And as I said, tried everything, nothing worked. A lot of the stuff actually made things worse. A lot of the herbalists and naturopath and all that kind of stuff actually made me feel worse. A lot of the physical manipulations made me feel worse. I remember once seeing a chiropractor, and afterwards I was like agonizing pain. I was like, oh my God, I'm never doing that again. So nothing seemed to work. Anyway, one evening I was like obsessively researching about health. I really couldn't cope with very much. I was so stressed that I couldn't even watch TV. It was too stressful for me, if that gives you an idea of how like overly stimulated I was, I guess. But I could read, and I would probably freak myself out reading about all the different things that it could be and all the rest of it, but not really making any progress. And I'd done loads of tests, as I said. Anyway, I came across this service that said, if you've ever done an ancestry test before, then you can upload that data to our site, and we'll provide all kinds of interpretation of that data for you, all kinds of reports and all of these different health issues. And I recognized a lot of the reports were like things that I'd been reading about, learning about, thinking I might have that might explain what's going on with me. So I was like, huh, I think I did one of those before. And I remembered this is 2021. Back in 2013, my wife and I both did a 23andMe test, and it was interesting, but we're both kind of white. There wasn't any major like shocks in there, like mainly European ancestry. It's like, oh, okay. But it didn't really mean much to me. My wife was kind of more into it. Like she found some family members as a result of it. Like I know you said your family member did, but for me it was like whatever. Anyway, uploading the data to the system, I was blown away. Like, I've never gone to a psychic or fortune teller or whatever and had that experience of like, oh my God, it's like they can read their mind. That's never happened to me, like in the movies. But this almost felt like that because it knew so much about me. And the crazy thing is, it knew that I had a lot of these issues that back when I first took my DNA in 2013, when I first did this saliva test, I didn't even have some of these issues. And yet it already knew that I would end up developing them, which kind of blew me away. And it gave me a lot of clues that ended up helping me to finally resolve this issue. And they're all quite complicated, so I don't know if we want to go into them in this podcast or not. I've talked about it in many other places. But they were obscure stuff, obscure toxicity. There was a specific toxin that had built up that I had no idea, no one had thought to test for. There were specific nutritional deficiencies that no one had thought to test for that were really key. So, and then there was a hormonal imbalance that, again, no one had been able to see. So all of these things I managed to work out. Not that your genetics can tell you if you definitely have any of those three things I just mentioned, but they can tell you you have a higher risk for them, which then makes it worth you testing, even if the test is expensive and even if no one else would think about it. You can kind of go to a doctor or a practitioner. You can insist, no, I really want this test, and usually they'll do it if you're willing to pay for it yourself. And so that's what I did. And it turned out that all these things are actually super accurate. And so I thought maybe it's a fluke, maybe it's just me. And so I'm one of those people, you might be the same, Lorianne, where once something works for me, I try and get everyone in my life to do it. So I got my wife to do it, and I got my friends to do it, and I got some of my family members to do it. I got as many of my employees to do it as were willing to do it. I got all my business partners to do it. And, and I would work with them. And again, long story short, I was just blown away. It seems to be extremely helpful for everyone. And not only is it helpful in like seeing your risk for something and getting personalized recommendations, which is the kind of obvious stuff that we do, but I noticed another dimension of it, which was really quite profound to me, which was like it really helped to have understanding and acceptance and compassion for myself, and then exactly the same thing for others as well. Just seeing these differences between us. So rather than like, oh, it's so easy for me to lose weight, why is this person finding it so hard? Or this, it's so difficult for me to deal with stress. Why does this other person find it so easy? Or it's so easy for me to, I don't know, digest carbs. Why does this person have such an issue? They have to be on a ketogenic diet, or like all kinds of stuff. Even personality traits are in there. Like it could tell you if you're more likely to be extroverted or introverted, if you're more likely to be, agreeable or disagreeable, all this kind of stuff. And yeah, one of the things it can tell you, and we have over 500 reports, but the reason I reached out to you, Lorianne, is because, one of them is about eating disorders. And when I looked into this, because I'm not an expert on every single thing we have 500 reports on, and I admit this is not one of them, but I saw that actually, so for this, we evaluate 11,026 genetic variants. So that's a lot. A lot of other services, I don't want to be negative about anyone, but when they tell you something about yourself, they're basically on one variant. So if you want, I can explain what variant means, but we have a team of dozens of AI engineers and dozens of full-time scientists who are building this machine so they can, rather than just saying, oh, you have this one thing, that means this, we're kind of calculating everything, if that makes sense, and coming to a conclusion about it. And so what was particularly notable to me that I learned this, again, from these scientists, not that I'm an expert in everything, is that around up to 80% of the differences in people's chances of developing eating disorders may well be due to genetics. And so back to that compassion thing for a second, like I had felt a lot of self-judgment and self-recrimination and all the rest of it, like endless, like, why did I do this? Why am I like this about certain things that I had? And really, there was, I'm not trying to let myself or anyone else off the hook, but you just have to be honest. And the honest truth is that a significant amount of what we are and what we do and what we have high risk for is genetic. It is kind of pre-programmed into us. And so when I saw that 80% reading, and only according to this, only about 1% of people actually do develop an eating disorder. It's relatively rare. But if there's an 80, I don't know if you agree with that, that's kind of the official statistics, but even 80% of the difference is actually in genetics, I would say that's very helpful to know that. Not in a disempowering way, like, oh, therefore there's nothing I can do about it, but in an empowering way, like, I can let myself off the hook for this, that that I've had this issue, and I can love myself and forgive myself and accept myself as I am. I can realize it's more difficult for me than for other people to not have this issue. And that's just the way it is. And maybe you need to forgive your parents for giving you the genes. I know I had to do a bit of that because my parents had a lot of health issues and have passed some stuff down to me. And so, okay, thanks guys, but it's just the way it is, I guess. And and let go of that and forgive that as well. But yeah, I thought that might be valuable for your audience to know. And then the other bit is if uh, this is helpful as well. Like for instance, all my life I had all these foods I couldn't eat, these allergies and intolerances, right? If I did, I had all these symptoms. And I always thought again it's genetics, just like I thought being underweight was genetics. Oh yeah, by the way, now I'm 180 pounds, 185 pounds, haven't put on any fat. I'm not big or small, I'm completely normal weight. And funnily enough, when I look at my genetic reports for whether I'm going to be overweight or underweight genetically, it says that I'm going to be normal weight. So all my life, I thought I was skinny because of my genetics, but then I got the report that said you're not skinny because of your genetics. You should be normal weight. And then when I started to resolve my digestive issues for the first time, I actually was normal weight. And so another example of that is like food allergies. I used to think, oh, there's all these foods I react to that I genuinely react to. I must have all these food allergies. But then when I did my genetic reports, I didn't have a genetic tendency to any food allergies except for one, which was gluten. So all the other things I reacted to, it wasn't based on genetics. And sure enough, as I started to get to the root of these digestive issues and resolve them, all of those allergies and intolerances went away. So the other piece of good news is if you get a report and it tells you you do not have a genetic tendency for this, I realize you might not believe us. You have to go through a lot of them to be convinced that we're really as accurate as we are. So that's fair enough. But once you believe that we're accurate, it can really help you to go, oh, okay, so this is not something that I am necessarily stuck with. This is something that is maybe a learned behavior from maybe some trauma, some whatever it might be. And the good news about that is that it is possible to fully overcome it, and there's not a genetic basis to it. So do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. It was actually funny that I always wondered about that because uh my my aunt, and I mean this is considering my age, I'm 61. My aunt had bulimia. And back then, of course, people didn't know what it was. But my mother used to say, yeah, she used to throw up her food. And then I thought, well, I have somebody in the family who had it. And I thought maybe, something somewhere was passed down to me. But I just want to understand, I guess, what is the difference between the genetics and DNA? Like so if it's not genetically passed down, but it's in your DNA, like what is the difference?
Yeah, sorry, I may have misstated that. So what I was saying is, in some cases, you have a problem, but we don't see it in your genetics or DNA. And what that
Okay.
tells me is it's going to be much, maybe not easier is the word, but it's much more possible to fully fix and probably easier to fix because it's something that's been created in your life by lifestyle and environment rather than something that you're born with. If it's something that you're born with, which means that it is in your genetics and DNA, then that means that it is going to be more of a challenge for you, probably a whole life. It still doesn't mean you're stuck with it, but it gives you oh, that's why it's harder for me than for most people to not have this problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. That's actually really interesting. I know that you also do, you have some other projects that you work on, some other businesses you have. Can you speak a little bit more to those as well?
Sure, yeah. So
Yeah.
Genetic Insights is geneticinsights.co. That's what we were just talking about. And it is my passion, but to be honest, my major passion is the 7-step rejuvenation blueprint, which is a book I'm working on. Hopefully it'll be out by the summer. But I already have episodes that kind of go over it on my YouTube channel for free, the Rejuvenate podcast. And anyway, what it basically is something that I created during those years. I mean, I've been studying nutrition since I was a child. By the way, I did it like in school and whatever. I've been into it for decades. But for those few years when I was really stuck and nothing was helping and no one was able to help me, I really investigated. What I must be missing something. Like occasionally I'd have those times of futility and despair, but most of the time I was like, there must be something that I'm missing here. There must be a solution, right? And so I kind of wanted to work out, what is it? And I realized every teacher, health teacher, practitioner, or whatever out there has stuff that they get and understand, which is why they help some people. But everyone also has some stuff that they miss, which is why they don't help everyone. And so I kind of wanted to create like a grand unified theory of like everything that it could be. And so that was became the 7-step rejuvenation blueprint. And I won't go through the whole thing, but step one was understanding your genetics. I realized that's not all there is to you being the best version of yourself, being healthy, being well, being happy, and all the rest of it, having energy, loving life. But it is the first step because you have to understand the blueprint. You have to understand the cards that you've been dealt, as it were. And so that's the first step. And then there's other steps. A lot of stuff that people may be familiar with. I can run through them if you like. And that's the other project. So that's like Feel Younger is where I provide people resources as part of that journey and information resources, physical resources. And so, yeah, those are my 3 projects and they're all interrelated. I hope you can see there's like, there's the physical resources, there's genetic resources and the information resources, but ultimately the goal is to help people to feel younger again in the best possible sense, not as naive and whatever you were when you were 20, but as much energy and like resilience and strength and enthusiasm for life, I guess, as most of us at least ideally had in our 20s.
Actually, I think it's kind of funny, and I bring this up. I mean, I know the millennials are now getting into their 40s, right? And and I'm 61, and when I hear them say, I feel so old, I'm so old, I'm looking at them going like, I feel none of that. Like, I feel like I'm in my 20s, but with the, knowing the knowledge that I have.
Which is the best
And
possible world, right?
yes, exactly. So I just sometimes think, like really, and I think that mindset even in itself is not healthy because they're making themselves feel old because they're telling them that. It's just like,
I,
speaking like what they say, be kind. You're the one who speaks to yourself the most, so be kind, right?
I 100% agree. And that is step 7 of my system. And I leave it till last, not because it's the least important, but because most people don't want to hear it, right? If you tell them that the reason why you're sick and you're not getting better is because of your mindset, no one wants to hear that. But if they've been through every other step and nothing else has worked, then we say, look, you got to look at your mindset. You got to look at, your core beliefs and like the feelings that you're habitually feeling. Because as you say, I 100% agree. And there is a ton of science behind it that the placebo effect and, which is what you're referring to there, the nocebo effect is real. The nocebo effect is you can take a healthy person and make them sick if you convince them that they are. Like they've done studies on this, person will think they're fine. The doctor will come in and say, oh, I've got a diagnosis. I'm terribly sorry. You're terribly ill. And the person will start manifesting all the symptoms of that, even though there's nothing wrong with them. And then they'll say, oh, well, actually, it was a mistake. There's nothing wrong with you. And then, it will all go away again. It's like your mind, your beliefs are very powerful. It's not as, you can't just usually talk yourself out of being, a severe illness, unfortunately, but your core beliefs absolutely do affect you very profoundly. I 100% agree with you.
And there's been a couple of people that I've known, one in the 40s, one in their 60s, where they did have life like threatening like situations, and both of them in fact came out of it with a negative attitude rather than saying, wow, I survived this. Wow, okay, so I do have some aftermaths of this, but I got through it. And so I was interested in that mindset because I mean, if I had a life-threatening, situation, and I got out of it, I think I'd be so grateful and like, wow, hey guys, I'm here. You're not getting rid of me yet. But yeah, very there's that negative energy that I feel, which I find is sad because I've heard so many people who've gone the opposite way, where they've had a heart attack or something, come out of it, and they're much more grateful and for everything they have.
I
So
think
this,
I think it goes one of two ways. I think you're right. I don't think there's many people are like, oh, same as before. I think you
yeah,
either go more toward, if you've suffered a lot, you either go more towards compassion and humility and gratitude because you have that insight, or if you don't, if you kind of stick with your pride and with your ego, you go the other direction and you go into
yeah,
resentment. How could life do this to me? How could God do
yeah,
this to me? It's not fair. And that starts to eat away at you. And I agree. I think a lot of the root cause of disease is that like resentment, not against maybe a person, but against life itself. Like
yeah,
life isn't fair and life has made me suffer. And I do understand. I mean, some people have been through horrific stuff, right? And
yeah,
it's completely understandable for someone to feel that way. But as you say, it's just not helpful to feel that way. It's not going to relieve their suffering. The only thing that relieves is, as you say, is to focus on what there is to be grateful for, right?
yeah. Yeah, and I think that that helps with healing too when you're grateful rather than I think it's it's yeah, it doesn't help if you're not. I think that and maybe not full healing, but definitely moving towards the better if you have a positive attitude rather than the negative.
Yeah, I've
So
seen studies on it, specifically on gratitude and forgiveness. They can see that it has a healing effect on the brain, those two emotions specifically, which I thought was very interesting because all
yes.
spiritual and religious people have been teaching that throughout the ages, and there is scientific evidence to back that up.
That's very interesting. So, tell us a little bit more. So you were saying you had the 2,3-B. That's actually what we took as well.
Mhm.
And so I was reading about how you can upload your already existing. I know you mentioned Ancestry as well. I actually have both too. I found
Mhm.
2,3-Me a little bit more comprehensive than Ancestry. Um,
Well, then you're
but
going to love our service because we're about. I don't feel like it's unhumble to say we will provide you with at least 100 times more useful information, at least when it
wow,
comes to health and well-being, not ancestry. Obviously, they focus on ancestry, but we
yeah.
focus on things like health and well-being, and we provide a hell of a lot more information than
So
they do.
I was wondering how that works though. Like, I mean, don't have to get into, but you said to upload that, but how does that work? Or do we do so there were two things that you provide the spit DNA test or that we can upload.
Mhm.
So is that like, yeah, just
On a,
curious how that works.
so just on a practical level, yeah. So what we
Yeah.
offer is access to a member site, where there is, maybe a library way of looking at it of all these different reports and all kinds of different topics that may be of interest to you. As I said, eating disorders is one version. We have several hundred which are health risks for all kinds of common health issues. We have maybe 60-ish on nutrients. So whether you have an increased need of every single nutrient that is, whether it's magnesium or, an amino acid like glycine or a vitamin like K2 or whatever, we have a report on every single one. Because if you have an increased need for a nutrient and then you get maybe less than the average person for a nutrient, it can lead to some really severe problems over decades, which is one of the things that happened to me. Whether you have an increased chance for allergies, and then there's also what I call the type reports. An example of that is like carbohydrates. Some people are a type that does well with carbohydrates, even simple carbohydrates, and they can have a lot and they'll just fine. Some people are the opposite type, which we call the hunter-gatherer type, who do very badly with carbohydrates, even a small amount, and even if it's complex carbs, and they often do very well on like a close to or ketogenic diet where they have very little carbs. So that's what I call a type report, because it's not like one is better than the other, it's just differences that are helpful to understand, and personality types and stuff like I mentioned before as that. So anyway, so all of that kind of information is available there, and geneticinsights.co, we do list a lot of it. um, and so you log into this membership site, and if you've never done one of those services before, like you mentioned, and it's not just those two, they're just the most popular, but pretty much any ancestry service, there's like a couple of dozen that we know work. You can upload that data. And so you have to get your raw data from that service. So I always just tell people, Google, how do I get my raw data from, and then X name of company, right? And usually be a guide. It's pretty simple. and then you download that data. And then when you start with us, you click this upload button and you just send it there. And then the AI behind the scenes does this magic and it processes your data. It usually takes several hours. Sometimes it takes longer. Usually it's done within a day. If it's not done within a day, it's a problem, but usually it's done within a few hours. And then magic, suddenly all these reports are available. And they're, by default, they're sorted by risk score. So you see all the things that you have a higher risk of first. In some cases, we give a percentage risk. And so what that means is, the things that you have a really high chance of will be right at the top of the list. Like for me, I mentioned digestive issues, but I always had sinus issues. And still for me, if I don't sleep enough, if I have too much stress, if I don't eat right or whatever, the first place it'll show up for me is my sinuses, because that's like my weakest link, if that makes sense. And so when I look at my sinus report, it says that I'm in the 99th percentile for sinus inflammation, meaning that in a room full of 100 people, I would be the most likely to have sinus issues. But of course, in that room full of 100 people, someone else might be the most likely to have depression. Someone else might be the most likely to have knee pain. Someone else might be the most likely to have urinary tract infections. And someone else might have the highest chance of having eating disorders. See, it just like everyone has a problem. It just shows where, if you're not doing your best, where it's likely to, manifest first for you. And so, yeah, then there are all these reports. You can read them online or you can download them and, save them offline, share them, print them, whatever you want. And they tell you lots of things, but the two key things they tell you is, first of all, what is your risk of having this particular issue or need? And then second, what are the recommendations? And the majority of the report is usually recommendations. And so it's like, based on your genetics, there are lots of things that people obviously recommend for different issues. Like for me, digestive issues, my God, books have been written, could probably fill a whole library of recommendations for digestive issues. So it's like, where do you start, right? And so it helps to narrow it down, because it says, based on your genetics, this is the thing that we think is the most helpful. And it gives you like, how much evidence is there? How much impact is it likely to have? And there's like, pretty much every sentence, I don't know if you looked at the sample I gave you, but pretty much every statement we make has scientific references to it. There's nothing that is not like highly referenced. Everything that we do is FDA and FTC compliant. So this is something you can happily share with your doctor. They may not listen, because some doctors don't listen to anyone, including other doctors. But if they're open-minded, it's like something that has scientific validity, is what I'm saying. And, an open-minded doctor will be willing to run a test if you show them a genetic report, for instance, that says you have a tendency.
Would
So
that be
yeah, does that
scary
answer the
for some
question?
people, though?
Yes, that's a great
Okay.
question. And the honest answer is yes. And so it's really back to that attitude thing that you said earlier. So just as you can take a moment of suffering and either make it as a reason to be resentful against life or a reason to be grateful, so you can take knowledge about yourself and use it either as an empowering tool to accept yourself as you are and massively improve the lot you've been given. But you can also use it as a thing to worry and be neurotic about, and make you collapse into a pit of despair. Like both options are there. When we have people who do have a tendency for neurosis, which, by the way, there's a strong genetic component to, so it's something that you can also measure. Neurotic, by the way, the real definition of it that I understand is simply a tendency to focus on the negative. So they're not always anxious or worried people. Like you can have a neurotic who's always angry. It's the same thing. They're always looking for reasons to be angry rather than. So if that is the person, I usually recommend, one of the other things we do, we offer what's called the Limitless package, where you have access to all 500, but we also do a lot of just collections that are significantly more affordable, that are just one area of focus. So we have like cardiovascular health, hormonal health, blood sugar balance, weight loss, all of that kind of stuff. Well, one of the categories we have is emotional well-being. And I always say, if you're scared about, oh my God, I have a higher chance of getting a heart disease or whatever it might be, don't get any of those reports. Just start with the emotional well-being reports, and it will give you some very helpful advice to just start feeling better in general. It focuses on all the factors that can influence emotional well-being, like your response to past trauma, or, hormonal balance, or levels of different neurotransmitters, risk of various different emotional issues that you can then go and see a professional about, like bipolar, borderline, just depression, anxiety, all of these kind of things. And so, and neuroticism being one of them, as we talked about. And so it can just start with the emotional well-being. Don't freak yourself out with hearing about any of the potential, health issues that you might also have a higher risk for. And I think that tends to work well.
That's interesting too. I was just thinking when you're saying that the emotional, because I mean, obviously, when you go to a therapist, a psychiatrist, or primarily therapy, like they'll ask you questions, and based on your answer, they have these little forms and they figure it out. But I mean, some of them are very arbitrary. Some of the questions that they ask and the answers are not just black and white. So this would be a very accurate way, I would imagine, more accurate than any sort of, those forms that they have filled out that end up at the end of it. Like even they do that for business, right? Some people, when they hire people, they'll put you through, I can't remember the name of it. That's silly of me. I know what I'm talking about, but they'll have you do some sort of, profile.
Yeah, there's
For
different
me.
ones out there. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
The Briggs, something more, that's
Yeah,
one
there's
of
Myers-Briggs is one.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. So, but this seems, because it's not made on, like it's set from your DNA, it would be the most accurate that you would ever get for an emotional person. Like, wouldn't it though? Because it's coming straight from your.
Yes and no. So the only caveat
Okay.
is, of course, it can't predict your actual environment and upbringing, right? It's only looking at your DNA. So
Okay.
you may have a much higher chance for depression, for instance, genetically. But if you had, just a flawless, highly supportive, nurturing environment and parents and all that, you might not be depressed still. Do you see what I mean? So there is still that aspect to it. But I
Okay.
agree. I don't think it's less accurate because, as you say, the problem with all of those tests, especially the self-reporting ones, require you to, first of all, be honest with the test, and second of all, to perceive yourself highly accurately, which, let's face it, most people don't. So
Yeah.
most people who do those personality tests, I've sometimes done them with people, and I'm like, what would you say for this? And they're like, oh, I don't do that. I'm like, really? I see you do it all the time. So a lot of people haven't got very good, self-awareness. So, and then if a psychiatrist or a professional is doing it for you, that's supposed to mitigate that. But still, I've seen it, court cases, different psychological health professionals have completely different conflicting diagnoses of the same person, right? So it's definitely not an exact science. And to be honest, what I like to look at actually is what I consider more the root of it, which is things like hormones and neurotransmitters. So I'll give you an example. Whenever I see someone who has a genetic tendency for low oxytocin, I say to them, do you have addictive tendencies? Do you find it hard to relax? And do you have a tendency to feel like there's an emptiness inside you that no matter what you do, you can't fill it? And they usually say, yes, my God, how did you know? And I said, well, because those are a classic signs of a lack of oxytocin. And when you have high levels of oxytocin, so oxytocin, they call it the love hormone, but I think of it more as the fulfillment hormone. It's more what it feels like to be loved is oxytocin. And some people just have genetically low levels and then they are never satisfied. They are never fulfilled. They're usually always busy and always doing stuff because they're trying to fill the hole. They are often involved in addictive behaviors because, again, they're trying to fill that hole inside themselves. And, they have a tendency for depression and stuff as well. And so, like, with understanding that to me is more, as you say, relevant than those tests, because then we can go, okay, what can we do to increase your oxytocin? Another example is cortisol. I have a genetic tendency to high cortisol. That's a stress hormone.
Okay.
Whenever someone has high levels of high cortisol, I'm like, do you find it hard to relax? Do you find that, you get stressed easily? Do you find it difficult to calm down? Do you find you're always on the go? Are you a type A personality? And they're always like, yes, 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 yes. Like, well, um, so, you need to address that, right? Maybe you need to balance the cortisol out with some more oxytocin because they do, what's the word, balance each other out. Maybe you need to reduce the cortisol. Maybe you need to increase like progesterone in women or testosterone in men. That kind of helps to balance it out. All of that. So there's all kinds of, what's the word, like tweaking and engineering you can do with the hormones once you understand it. But again, unless you know you have that tendency, like my whole life, I was this, like person who could never relax and always wanted to get, achieve stuff. It's a little bit different. I know these descriptions sound similar, but the low oxytocin person is trying to fill a hole inside themselves, where the cortisol person just can't stop doing stuff. They want to achieve stuff. It's a little bit kind of different. But they look pretty similar on the outside. Neither of them can relax. And, that's like really helpful to know that stuff about yourself. And it's been huge for me. And it's helpful to know that about, let's say, your wife or your son or your father or whatever. Like, oh, that's why, X, like it helps to understand them, have compassion for them, and then also, yeah, actually help them because you can say, oh, you can do stuff for that.
Yeah. Actually, I was just thinking about that, and I don't know if it's bring up, but the ADHD thing is very big these days, and sounds to me like this would be something worthwhile to look into to see about those little tweakings of here and there.
Definitely.
That,
I think you're right to bring that up, and I relate it to high cortisol and high adrenaline.
yeah.
They tend to blame it on low dopamine, which is why they give them kind of pseudoamphetamines and stuff. But when you have very high adrenaline and cortisol, you tend to eventually have low dopamine, so they are connected. But yeah, often with ADHD, if you give them progesterone, then they just calm down. And I'm not saying all the ADHD is genetic because it's got worse. And the reason it's got worse is because of social media and media in general and overstimulation and all of that stuff. Everything that everyone blames in the world is true. But there is also a genetic component that means that even though the world is as it is, some people have it and some people don't. And that is largely still down to genetics, I would say. And so, as you say, it's like really helpful to know that. And especially if there is that hormone or neurotransmitter imbalance that is not just created by your environment, but that it's innate. It's very difficult to shift something that's innate without like really understanding it and doing something pretty serious. Like taking someone who has genetically low GABA, which is your natural sedative, and genetically high adrenaline, which is your natural stimulant. If you take someone like that and say, oh, you should just relax more, you should meditate, you should read a book, whatever. And then if people try and do that stuff, not only will it not work, it will probably actually make them feel worse, And so you have to kind of understand people and meet them where they're at. Like, for someone else, like the person teaching that, they're not wrong. I'm sure it helps them to meditate or whatever, but it doesn't work for everyone because they're differently wired.
And I love that. And thank you so much for being on the show because I have different people because of exactly that. There's not everything that is for everyone. And so at least it gives my listeners a informed choice of what they would like to pursue. And I found this totally fascinating, and I really appreciate you sharing all this with us. Just before we go, though, I'd like to just finalize this with you. Please going through again where people can find you. Might want to spell it out a bit too, because us Canadians and Americans may not fully understand
Yeah, thank you.
your
Maybe you want to
accent.
repeat it in an understandable accent. I know that I've spent time in the States, especially and sometime in Canada, and I know. So I'll do my best. First of all, I just want to offer you guys, your audience, a coupon. If now I've hundreds of hours of free information, education, all kinds of topics on the Rejuvenate podcast. Doesn't cost a penny. Totally happy to obviously people to take that as they want. But if you're interested in finding out about your genetics and how they impact your health and well-being and all that stuff we talked about, that's our service at geneticinsights.co. So that's geneticinsights.co, not .com, .co. If you go there and use the code Bleep Bulimia, then with all capital letters, no spaces, then we'll be happy to give you 25% off any of our Genetic Insights collections.
Beautiful. And then, of course, we also have, so they can find you also, you said you have it's on YouTube, your podcast?
Yes, YouTube and also everywhere else that podcasts are, mainly on Spotify and Apple is usually where people find us. I'll usually say YouTube first, though, because I answer so far, I mean, I might not be able to do this forever, but so far I answer everyone's questions on YouTube. So if anyone has questions, And to let you know the type of podcasts we do, sometimes we do episodes like this where we have guests on, but usually we do like me doing a deep dive on a topic. Like you mentioned ADHD, I've done an episode on that. I've done an episode on cardiovascular health, on the liver, on the thyroid, on digestion, whatever. Like, so you don't have to listen to every episode, but if there's a specific topic you're interested in, if you want to hear my take on weight loss, if you want to hear my take on digestion or whatever it might be, check out that podcast. There's an episode that gives you like a complete guide for that specific topic.
Okay, so they would just do a search for the Rejuvenate podcast.
Yes, or to be honest, I think if you just search Elwin Robinson, it will probably come up as well, which is my name, because there aren't many Elwin Robinsons, so I'm lucky in that regard, I guess.
Oh, that's wonderful. Again, thank you so much for being here with me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this episode. Be sure to visit me at bleepbulimia.com.